In 1983, Steve Jobs sat across from the president of Pepsi and asked him a question. "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water?" he said. "Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" The man's name was John Scully. He said yes. He left Pepsi and came to Apple. Jobs was 28 years old. He had started Apple in his parents' garage 7 years earlier. Now it was one of the biggest technology companies in the country, and he believed Scully could help him take it further. For a while, it worked. Scully ran the business side, Jobs ran the product side, Apple kept growing. But the two men saw the world differently. And when Apple started to struggle, those differences became a war. It was a war inside the company, and only one of them could win. 2 years later, Scully asked the Apple board of directors to remove Steve Jobs. The board voted. Every single member chose Scully. The man who built Apple was pushed out of his own company. Steve Jobs was born in San Francisco in 1955. His birth parents were students at the University of Wisconsin. They were young and unmarried. They could not keep the baby. His mother found a couple who wanted to adopt. The husband was a lawyer. They were wealthy and well-educated. But when the baby arrived, the couple changed their minds. They wanted a girl. The hospital called someone else, Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul had served in the Coast Guard. He worked as a machinist. Clara was a bookkeeper. They had not been to college. But they wanted a child more than anything. When the birth mother learned this, she refused to sign the adoption papers. She wanted her son raised by college-educated people. Paul and Clara made a promise. They would send the boy to college, no matter what it cost them. It took days, but finally she signed. The family moved to Mountain View, California, a quiet town south of San Francisco in an area that would later be called Silicon Valley. Paul built a workbench in the garage. He gave Steve a small corner of it. Together, they took apart old radios and put them back together. Paul was careful with everything he built. He taught Steve that even the parts nobody could see should be done right. When they built a fence, Paul made the back look just as good as the front. Steve was a smart child, but he hated school. He played pranks and got into trouble. When he was 12, he needed some parts for a project. So he looked up the CEO of Hewlett-Packard in the phone book and called him at home. They talked for 20 minutes. The man gave him the parts and offered him a summer job. That was the kind of kid Steve Jobs was. He did not wait for permission. One afternoon, he told a girl from across the street that he was adopted. She looked at him and said, "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" He ran into the house, crying. His parents sat him down. They looked him in the eye. "No," they said, "you have to understand. We specifically picked you out." They said it slowly. They meant every word. When people later called Paul and Clara his adoptive parents, Jobs would stop them. "They were my parents," he said, 1,000%. When Steve Jobs was 13, a friend introduced him to Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was 18 and could build almost anything with a circuit board. Wozniak was quiet and shy. He loved building things more than talking about them. Jobs was the opposite. He loved talking about things almost as much as building them. They became close. Together, they built small devices called blue boxes that could trick the phone system into making free long-distance calls. It was illegal, but they sold about 200 of them. Wozniak built them. Jobs sold them. That was the pattern from the beginning. After high school, Jobs entered Reed College in Portland, Oregon. It was expensive. His parents were spending their life savings on his tuition. After 6 months, Jobs could not see the point. He dropped out. But he did not leave campus. For the next 18 months, he slept on friends' floors. He returned Coke bottles for food money. Every Sunday night, he walked 7 miles across town for a free meal at a Hare Krishna temple. He dropped in on classes that interested him. One of them was a calligraphy class. The teacher showed him how letters could be beautiful, how the space between words mattered as much as the words themselves. He learned about serif fonts and sans serif fonts, about the tiny differences that made one word look elegant and another look ordinary. Jobs loved it. He had no idea what it would lead to, but he never forgot those letters. By 1976, Jobs was back in California. He was 21. He had no money and no degree. But Wozniak had built something, a small computer, just a circuit board with a chip on it. Jobs looked at it and said, "We should sell this." Wozniak was not sure. Jobs was sure enough for both of them. To raise money, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his scientific calculator. Together, they had $1,300. On April 1, 1976, they started Apple Computer in the Jobs family garage. A third partner, Ronald Wayne, joined them. But 12 days later, he sold his share back for $800. Their first real customer was a computer shop in Mountain View called the Byte Shop. The owner ordered 50 computers. They did not have 50 computers. They barely had the parts. But Jobs got a loan. He bought the parts on credit, and they started building. First in his bedroom, then, when there was no more space, in the garage. They worked through the night. Jobs's mother brought them sandwiches. His father cleared space on the workbench. A neighbor remembered Jobs greeting customers at the door, barefoot and wearing torn jeans. Nobody took them very seriously, not yet. In 1977, Apple released the Apple II. It had color graphics. It came inside a real plastic case. It was one of the first personal computers that looked like a product, not a science project. A businessman named Mike Markula believed in what Jobs and Wozniak were building. He invested his own money and helped turn Apple into a real company. The garage days were over. Apple moved into offices. They hired engineers, designers, salespeople. By 1979, the company had over 1,000 employees. Jobs was 24. That same year, Jobs visited a research lab called Xerox PARC. What he saw inside changed everything. The researchers had built a computer with pictures on the screen instead of just text. You could point at things and click on them with a small device called a mouse. Nobody at Xerox understood what they had. Jobs understood it immediately. He ran around the room. He could not believe what he was seeing. He asked the researchers why they were not doing anything with it. They had no answer. This was the future, and he was going to build it. And then, on December 12, 1980, Apple went public. The phones started ringing before the stock market even opened. Apple sold 4.6 million shares at $22 each. They sold out almost immediately. By noon, every share was gone. The stock had jumped to $29. It was the biggest technology offering since Ford in 1956. About 40 Apple employees became millionaires that morning. Steve Jobs was 25 years old, and in a single day, he was worth more than $200 million. Wozniak had given some of his own shares to employees who would not have received any. He wanted everyone to share the moment. Jobs did not do the same. He was already thinking about what came next. But success was changing him, or maybe it was showing who he already was. He had a daughter. Her name was Lisa. Her mother was his girlfriend, Chrisann Brennan. Jobs refused to accept that the child was his. He told a court he could not have children. It was not true. He would not become part of Lisa's life for years. At work, he screamed at engineers until they cried. He told people their work was garbage. He parked in spaces reserved for disabled drivers. He was building one of the most important companies in the world, but he could not see the people around him. By 1983, Apple was in the Fortune 500. It was worth more than $1 billion. Jobs decided he needed help, someone who knew how to run a company this big. He found John Sculley at Pepsi. Sculley arrived in the spring of 1983. He wore suits. He understood marketing and profit margins. Jobs wore jeans and sneakers. He understood something else. After seeing the technology at Xerox, Jobs had started a secret project inside Apple. A new kind of computer. He called it the Macintosh. The Mac team worked in a separate building. Jobs hung a pirate flag above the door. Better to be a pirate than join the Navy, he told them. The Mac team was small, about 20 people. Jobs chose every one of them himself. They worked late into the night. They ate pizza on the floor. They believed they were building something that would change the world. The rest of Apple called them spoiled. Jobs gave his team the best equipment, the best offices, the biggest budget. He once walked into the regular Apple building and told the engineers there that their work was not good enough, that only the Mac team was doing real work. It did not make him popular. He pushed them harder than anyone had pushed them before. He wanted every detail to be perfect. When the engineers showed him the circuit board inside the Mac, he sent them back. The chips were not arranged neatly enough. Nobody will ever see the inside of this computer, they told him. I will see it, he said. It was the same thing his father had taught him in the garage. The back of the fence matters. And there was something else. The Mac would have beautiful fonts on the screen, different sizes, different styles. No personal computer had ever done this before. Jobs had remembered the calligraphy class he took years ago at Reed College. The letters he had learned to draw by hand were now inside a machine. On January 24, 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh. Jobs stood on stage in a dark theater. He pulled the Mac out of a bag. He pressed a button. The computer introduced itself. Hello, it said in a small digital voice. I am Macintosh. The audience stood up and cheered. In the first 100 days, Apple sold 70,000 Macs. It sounded like a triumph. But then, sales started to slow. The Mac was beautiful, but it was too expensive. It did not have enough software, and it was slow. Customers stopped buying. The numbers dropped month after month. Inside Apple, people started to whisper. The Mac was Jobs' project, and it was failing. The Apple II was still making most of the company's money. But Jobs had ignored the Apple II team for years. They were angry. The board started asking hard questions. How long could Apple keep losing money on the Macintosh? Sculley watched the numbers. He started asking questions. The pirate flag was still flying above the Mac building. But inside, the mood had changed. By early 1985, Apple reported its first quarterly loss. Scully blamed Jobs. Jobs blamed Scully. The company was being pulled in two directions. Scully wanted order. Forecasts, budget, structure. Jobs wanted revolution. In April, Scully went to the board. He told them he could not run the company with Jobs interfering. He gave them a choice: back me or find yourself a new CEO. Jobs heard about the meeting. He tried to gather support from the board members before the vote. He called them one by one. Some were sympathetic, but none of them were willing to bet the company on him. The problem was not just the Mac, it was Jobs himself. He had made too many enemies. He had insulted too many people. The same passion that built Apple was now tearing it apart. On April 10th, the board met. The meeting lasted hours. Jobs made his case. He believed the Mac would succeed. He believed Scully was wrong. But the numbers were on Scully's side, and the board needed someone they could trust to stop the bleeding. They voted. Every member chose Scully. Jobs was removed from the Macintosh division. He was not fired, not exactly. He still had his title, he still had his office. But he had no team, no product, nothing to do. In May, Jobs tried one last move. He planned to take control while Scully was traveling overseas. Someone told Scully. The plan fell apart. After that, Jobs was moved to a small office in a building far from everyone else. He called it Siberia. He came to work, but there was no work. He walked the empty hallways. He drove around Silicon Valley for hours. Sometimes he called old friends. Sometimes he just sat in his car in the parking lot. He had built one of the most famous companies in America. And now, he sat in an empty office with nothing to do. The people who had worked with him did not call. The industry that had celebrated him moved on. He thought about what he had done wrong. He thought about the people he had hurt, the engineers he had screamed at, the friends he had pushed away. Years later, he would say that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to him. But at the time, it did not feel that way. At the time, it felt like the end. For the first time in his life, Steve Jobs had no plan. The company he had started in his parents' garage, the company he had named, the company he had built from nothing, no longer wanted him. On September 17, 1985, Steve Jobs wrote a one-page letter to the board. In the letter, he resigned from Apple. He took 5 employees with him. And then he did something that surprised everyone. He sold every share of Apple stock he owned, all of it, millions of dollars worth. It was a message. He was done. He wanted nothing to do with the company that had rejected him. He kept a single share, just one. He was 30 years old. He had $100 million, and he had nothing to do. He could have stopped. $100 million was more than enough for a lifetime. But Steve Jobs did not stop. Within weeks, Jobs started a new company. He called it Next. He wanted to build the most advanced computer in the world, this time for universities. The machine was beautiful, a perfect black cube made of magnesium. Jobs spent months getting the angles right. But it cost more than $6,500. Almost no one could afford it. In its entire lifetime, Next sold about 50,000 computers. It was a commercial failure. But someone at a research lab in Switzerland used a Next computer to build something that would change the world. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and what he built was the World Wide Web. Jobs did not know this at the time. He only knew his company was burning money. In 1986, a year after leaving Apple, Jobs bought a small computer graphics company from the filmmaker George Lucas. He paid $10 million for it. The company was called Pixar. Most people thought he was throwing his money away. A computer graphics company run by artists and dreamers. At first, Pixar tried to sell hardware. It did not work. The company lost money year after year. Jobs kept writing checks, millions of dollars from his own pocket. At one point, he had put nearly $50 million into Pixar. He thought about selling. He came close more than once. But something kept him going. He saw what the artists could do with the technology. He believed in them even when the numbers said he was wrong. People around him wondered why he kept going. But inside Pixar, a small team of artists had a different idea. They did not want to sell machines. They wanted to make movies. They had been making short animated films with their computers. The films were good, really good. In 1991, Pixar signed a deal with Disney to make a full-length animated film. It took them 4 years. That same year, 1991, Jobs married Lauren Powell. They would have 3 children together. On November 22, 1995, Toy Story premiered in theaters. It was the first feature-length film made entirely by computers. Every frame, every character, every shadow. Critics loved it. Audiences loved it. Children watched it again and again. The film earned $373 million at the box office worldwide. Jobs had spent a decade in the wilderness. 2 companies, one that barely sold anything, one that almost went bankrupt. And now, at the premiere of a movie about toys, he was back. A week later, Pixar went public. The stock price doubled on the first day. Jobs owned 80% of Pixar. In a single afternoon, his shares were worth more than $1 billion. 10 years after being pushed out of Apple, Steve Jobs was a billionaire again. Not because of computers, because of a movie about a cowboy and a spaceman. But back in Cupertino, the company he had built was dying. After Jobs left, Apple tried 3 different CEOs in 10 years. Scully lasted until 1993. The board replaced him. His replacement lasted 2 years. Then they tried again. None of them could fix what was broken. Apple made too many products. Dozens of different computers, most of them confusing, most of them losing money. The company's share of the computer market had fallen below 5%. Apple was losing $1 billion a year. Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, was asked what he would do if he ran Apple. He said he would shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. By late 1996, Apple had about 90 days of cash left. 90 days. That was all that stood between Apple and the end. The company needed a new operating system. Its own software was falling apart. They looked at a company called B. The founder was Jean-Louis Gasset, a former Apple executive. Gasset wanted too much money. The deal collapsed. And so Apple turned to Next, the company Steve Jobs had built after leaving. The computer had failed, but the software inside it was years ahead of anything else. In February 1997, Apple bought Next for $429 million. Steve Jobs walked back into Apple, 12 years after being pushed out. At first, his title was just informal advisor. He sat in on meetings, he asked questions. But everyone in the building, knew something had changed. The CEO at the time, Gil Amelio, had been there for about 500 days. He had not stopped the bleeding. In July 1997, the board removed Amelio. 2 months later, Steve Jobs became the interim CEO. He added a small letter to his title. He called himself ICEO. His salary was $1 a year. The first thing he did was look at Apple's product line. He drew a simple grid on a whiteboard, 2 columns, consumer and professional, 2 rows, desktop and portable, 4 squares, 4 products, everything else would be cut. Dozens of projects were canceled in a single meeting. Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, he told his team. People were let go. Projects that teams had worked on for years were canceled overnight. It was brutal, but without it, Apple would have been dead in 3 months. Jobs also launched a new advertising campaign. 2 words on a black screen, think different. It was not about a product. It was about an idea. That the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Then he did something nobody expected. He picked up the phone and called Bill Gates. Apple and Microsoft had been rivals for years, but Apple was dying and Jobs needed help. Gates agreed to invest $150 million. In return, Microsoft would keep making its Office software for the Mac. At the Macworld conference in Boston, Jobs announced the deal on stage. Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen behind him. The audience booed. Jobs later called it one of his worst moments on stage. But the deal kept Apple alive, and that was all that mattered. The bleeding had stopped, but stopping the bleeding was not the same as healing. In 1998, Apple released a new computer called the iMac. It did not look like any computer anyone had ever seen. It was shaped like a bubble, translucent blue plastic. You could see inside it. A young British designer named Joni Ive had created it. Jobs had found Ive buried in the design department, almost ready to quit. Together, they shared the same belief: technology should be beautiful. The iMac sold nearly 800,000 units in its first 5 months. Apple was profitable again. People who had never thought about buying a computer walked into stores because of the way the iMac looked. Jobs had proved something. Technology did not have to be gray and boring. It could be something you wanted to put on your desk and look at. In 2000, Jobs dropped the word interim from his title. He was now the permanent CEO of Apple. He had a new idea. The Mac would become the center of your digital life. Your music, your photos, your movies, all in one place. In 2001, Apple opened its first retail stores. Experts said it would fail. That same year in October, Jobs stood on a small stage and pulled something from his pocket. A white device, slightly larger than a deck of cards, with a small screen and a wheel you could turn with your thumb. He called it the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Other companies had made portable music players before, but they were ugly and hard to use. The iPod was simple. You turn the wheel, you press the center button, that was it. Jobs had rejected dozens of designs before this one. He wanted something so simple that a child could use it without reading a manual. The engineers told him it was impossible to make it that simple. He told them to try harder. When the final version was ready, Jobs held it in his hand and smiled. It weighed less than 200 grams. 2 years later, Apple launched the iTunes Store. You could buy any song for 99 cents. The music industry had been fighting against the internet for years. Jobs gave them a deal they could accept. He called every major record label himself. He sat in their offices and told them the future was digital, and they could either be part of it or be destroyed by it. One by one, they signed. In the first week, the iTunes store sold over 1 million songs. Within a year, the number passed 70 million. Over the next 6 years, Apple sold more than 100 million iPods. The company that had been 90 days from death was now one of the most admired brands in the world. And then one morning, a doctor told Steve Jobs to go home and get his affairs in order. In October 2003, Jobs had a medical scan. The doctors found a tumor on his pancreas. Pancreatic cancer is one of the deadliest forms of the disease. Most people who get it do not survive. The doctors told him he had 3 to 6 months to live. Get your affairs in order is a doctor's way of saying prepare to die. Jobs lived with that diagnosis all day. He thought about his children. He thought about what he had not yet finished. He had spent his whole life building things, and now a doctor had told him he had 3 months left. That evening, a biopsy came back. The doctors looked at the cells under a microscope. When they saw the results, the doctors started crying. It was a very rare form, the kind that could be treated with surgery. For the first time that day, Jobs had a chance. But he did not take it right away. For 9 months, he refused the operation. He tried special diets. He tried alternative treatments. He had always believed he could bend the world to his will. He had done it with computers. He had done it with movies. He tried to do it with his own body. But cancer does not care about willpower. Months passed. The tumor was still there. It may have been growing. His wife begged him to have the surgery. His friends told him he was making a mistake. In July 2004, he finally agreed. Doctors at Stanford Medical Center removed the tumor. The surgery took hours. He survived. He went back to work within weeks. He had lost weight, but his mind was the same as before, sharp and restless. A year later, on a warm morning in June 2005, Jobs stood in front of the graduating class at Stanford University. He told them 3 stories, one about dropping out of college, one about being fired from Apple, and one about facing death. He spoke quietly. No slides, no product demos, just a man in a black turtleneck standing in the sun talking about what he had learned. When I was 17, I read a quote. He said, "If you live each day as if it were your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It scared me, and for the next 33 years, I looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself one question. If today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do? Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered, he said. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. He finished with words from a magazine he had loved as a young man. Stay hungry, he told them. Stay foolish. The speech lasted 15 minutes. It would become one of the most watched speeches in the world. Jobs was alive, and he had one more thing to show. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco. The room was packed. Every seat was taken. He smiled. He looked comfortable up there, the way he always did. Every once in a while, he said, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. He told the audience that today, Apple was introducing 3 new products. First, a widescreen iPod with touch controls. Second, a revolutionary mobile phone. Third, a breakthrough internet device. He listed them again: an iPod, a phone, an internet device. Again, an iPod, a phone, an internet device. The audience began to laugh. "Are you getting it?" Jobs said. "These are not three separate devices. This is one device." The room exploded with cheers and applause. He called it the iPhone. A phone that had no buttons, just a screen you could touch with your finger. You could scroll through your music, you could browse the internet, you could make a call. All of it just by touching glass. On June 29, 2007, the iPhone went on sale. People lined up outside Apple stores the night before. Some had been waiting for days. Apple sold 1 million iPhones in the first 74 days. Within 5 years, the iPhone would become the most profitable product in the history of technology. It changed the phone industry overnight. Companies that had dominated the market for decades suddenly found themselves years behind. Nokia, BlackBerry, Motorola, companies worth billions of dollars, one by one they fell. The smartphone era had begun, and Apple was leading it. That same year, Apple dropped the word computer from its name. It was now just Apple. Remember what Michael Dell had said: "Shut Apple down, give the money back." By 2011, Apple was worth more than Dell, more than Microsoft, more than any technology company on Earth. But Jobs was getting thinner. In 2009, he took a 6-month leave from Apple. He flew to Tennessee for a liver transplant. He came back, he kept working, but anyone who saw him could tell. His jeans hung loose, his face was thin. At product launches, the audience clapped, but some of them looked worried. He stood on stage in June 2011 and presented iCloud. It was his last keynote. His voice was steady, but his body was not. His body was giving up what his mind refused to accept. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs wrote one last letter to the Apple Board of Directors. "I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties at Apple, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." The letter was short, just a few lines. No drama, no grand statements. He had filled stadiums with his product launches. Now he said goodbye in a few quiet lines. He recommended Tim Cook as his replacement. The board agreed. 26 years earlier, he had written a letter resigning from the company that no longer wanted him. Now he was writing a letter, leaving the company that needed him more than ever. In his final weeks, he spent time at home with his wife and children. He talked about design. He talked about Apple's future. He talked about the boats he had wanted to build. He once told his biographer that he wanted to show his children what their father had done. That was why he agreed to the book. He wanted them to understand why he had worked so hard and why he had not always been there. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at home in Palo Alto. He was 56 years old. His family was with him. His sister Mona later wrote about his final moments. She said he looked at his children, one by one, then he looked at his wife, then he looked past them all. His last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." That evening, Apple's website showed a single black and white photograph of Jobs, nothing else, just his face and 2 dates. 1955 to 2011. Nobody knows what he saw in that final moment. A simple wooden desk by a window. Soft morning light coming through the glass. A pair of round glasses resting on the wood. An empty chair pushed back slightly, and silence